Hey guys, so today we're going to start talking about the history of evolutionary theory, so some of the scientists involved in developing this theory, and also we're going to talk about the evidence to support the theory of evolution. So let's first set up some historical context for evolutionary theory. Here's a list of 8 scientists, and we're going to quickly go through how they all contributed to this theory. So we start with Aristotle, a famous philosopher, and he proposed this idea of scala natura. And what this meant pretty much was that he classified organisms according to complexity. So he had least complex all the way to most complex. Of course, at that time, humans wanted to put themselves first, and so he put humans at the top of this complex tree. This is the first time that we actually see a phylogenetic tree. It just wasn't named that at the time. Currently, humans are not at the top of any evolutionary tree. We're actually mixed in with other organisms. Carolus Linnaeus, he was responsible for developing this taxonomy that we use for organisms. So he studied binomial nomenclature, which is naming organisms using their genus and species. We'll talk about that in a later video in our next unit. Cuvier, he studied fossils and he actually opposed Darwin's theory. So what he proposed was that the fossils that he was studying, or the organisms that were fossilized, the changes that he saw in those fossils were due to catastrophic events on Earth, not due to natural selection. And so he was constantly going against Darwin, saying that his theory was incorrect. James Hutton developed a theory of gradualism. So what he suggested was that Earth gradually changed over a long period of time, and that the changes of Earth did not occur very rapidly. This was important because it was the first time that someone was saying, maybe Earth isn't as young as we think it is. It wasn't until Lyell came along that he vehemently advocated the age of Earth. So he was telling the scientific community that Earth was much older than 6,000 years. He also was a geologist, so he published his work in the Principles of Geology. Again, he showed how Earth's change occurred very slowly due to different fossil evidence that he had collected, mostly fossil evidence. But again, suggested that Earth was not 6,000 years old. It was actually much older than that. And so James Hutton and Lyell actually worked together. Lyell used Hutton's idea of gradualism in his work of Principles of Geology. Coming up next was Lamarck, who suggested this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics, or use and disuse. An example of Lamarck's idea of evolution is using giraffes. And so what he would suggest is that, for example, there were giraffes in an area where low vegetation on the ground was scarce. And so what some giraffes had to do is stretch their necks really long and reach the top of the trees. And so they acquired that characteristic. All they had to do was stretch their necks, and they now have long necks. So according to Lamarck, that's where giraffes get their long necks from. They needed it, or they needed to use it, so they acquired it, but just by stretching. And they didn't need the short necks, so they got rid of that in their population. We know that this is not true. If this were true, you would expect, for example, that if a father was very muscular, he's going to pass on those muscles to his offspring. That's not true. That has an effect, but he doesn't pass on that acquired characteristics. And so Lamarck was on the right path of evolution, just not quite there yet. And then we have Wallace and Darwin. These two people worked on their work kind of hand in hand. Wallace was publishing an essay on natural selection at the same time Darwin was working on it. However, Darwin is credited with it. There's some debate on who came up with the theory first. There's actually evidence to support the fact that Darwin stole Wallace's work and published it in his book. But I guess that could be up for debate. So Darwin is really the #1 person credited with the theory of natural selection. He proposed descent with modification. So all living organisms share a common ancestor, and that each of those descendants were modified from that common ancestor. And in 1859, he published his work on the origin of species, which was a huge landmark event for evolutionary theory. All right, so now we're going to pick up pace a little bit. Some of the evidence for evolution. You should remember most of this from biology. We have the fossil record. We can use radiometric dating and half-life to determine the age of fossils. An example of a very famous fossil is Archaeopteryx, which links reptiles to birds. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. Comparative biochemistry and molecular biology. This is when we compare, let's say, amino acid sequences or biochemical pathways of organisms. And so we can actually link which organisms are most similar based on these sequences or their pathways, and which ones are further distantly related. Comparative embryology. This is comparing embryos of different animals at different times. I'll show you some diagrams that have how that supports evolution. Biogeography. So we have this idea of continental drift and plate tectonics. So at one time, all of the continents were together. Due to plate tectonics, they slowly separated apart. And that is evidence of evolution, or how organisms drift apart. And then we have comparative anatomy. That's comparing different structures of organisms. And so we're going to talk about homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures in just a minute. Here's a fossil of Archaeopteryx, which linked reptiles and birds, and here's what scientists suggest it looks like. They have some bird characteristics, like the claws, the long tail that have many vertebrae, but then some of the avian characteristics are things like the wings. They also have these toothed beaks, which also suggest reptilian descent. So this was the best example that we had linking reptiles and birds. This slide goes over comparative biochemistry and molecular biology. You can see here the sequence of amino acids for the hemoglobin molecules for different species: humans, horse, gorillas, chimpanzees, zebras. If you were to go through and compare amino acid by amino acid, what you would see is that humans are identical in this one segment of hemoglobin as chimpanzees. So in terms of hemoglobin, our closest living relative is chimpanzees. Same thing with cytochrome C, which we find in aerobic respiration. It's a protein, aerobic organisms. You can see a cladogram. We'll talk about that later, but you can see how different organisms are separated according to their protein sequences of cytochrome C. Humans and chimpanzees are 100% identical. Humans and mice are 91.3, and so forth. These euglenas are very distantly related from humans in terms of cytochrome C. This diagram shows different organisms at different stages of their embryonic development. So what you can see, you have a fish, a pig, and a human. You can see that the fish, pig, and human all look almost identical when they're first developing as an embryo. All of these organisms look identical. This is evidence of evolution. We all begin very similar in shape, and it's not until very later in our embryonic development that we start seeing those differences. We all start with a gill pouch. They just develop into different structures in different organisms. Biogeography is illustrated here. As you can see that there is a camel family, these three different organisms of the camel family, but they are spread throughout the continents. This suggests that at one point they were all located together, meaning they could travel wherever they wanted, but as the continents drifted, they were then isolated. And so you only find each of these different members in distinct areas. And lastly, what you can see is the different structures that we talked about. So you have homologous structures here. Homologous structures are structures homologous structures are structures that have a very similar internal anatomy. So what you can see here between the human, the cat, the whale, the bat, is that they all have the same bones, they're just modified differently. So same structure, different function. All of these serve different functions. That's homologous structures. This is different from analogous structures, which are structures that have the same overall function, but it's not because they're closely related, it's because they evolved in the same environment. For an example, birds and insects. They both have wings, but though birds and insects are not closely related at all. It's because they both fly that they developed wings. So these structures were developed because of similar environments, not because of common ancestors. And then we also have vestigial structures, which are structures that no longer serve a purpose. If we're using the examples of snakes, snakes actually have hind legs or remnants of hind legs in their skeletal structure. Why do they need that? Well, we can assume that at one time reptiles had legs or were able to support themselves, and snakes lost that ability and became more successful. So all of this is evidence for evolution. Again, make sure you can define those terms, homologous, analogous, and vestigial structures, and can just quickly give me some examples of the different evidence for evolution.